This is The Allusionist, in which I, Helen Zaltzman, watch language turn into a bat and fly from my clutches. This is the 4th episode of our Draculae mini-series, and probably the final one, although it's not like I'm putting a wooden stake through its heart to put it to eternal rest, so who knows. The other 3 episodes are about how Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula was contemporarily adapted into Swedish and thence Icelandic, with a liberal approach to the source material that has made these texts extra compelling and mysterious to readers in the present. This episode departs from those novels, is more inspired by, in a way that is thematically appropriate. You don't have to have listened to the rest of the Draculae series to make sense of this one, although do listen to them for a fun and delightfully weird time. They are all available on your pod feed, same as this one, and at theallusionist.org, where every episode of the show has its own post containing the transcript, different ways to listen, plus links to the people in the episodes and to some of the materials I've perused while researching them. There is loads of interesting stuff related to what's in this episode. It is a big topic, and smart people have a lot to say about it, so check it out. Content note: this episode contains some references to, but not descriptions of, sexual content and sex slavery. There is also mention of J.K. Rowling. Let there be no doubt, here at The Allusionist, we want to protect trans rights and trans lives. On with the show. Throughout this Draculae series, there has been a question I've kept asking. Why is it that there's a lot more uproar about this, which you could term a sort of literary cover version, whereas music, totally normal. Films are remade all the time, especially in the last couple of decades, just like this churn of old IP. And yet with book, it's extraordinary. And I wonder why that is.
Yeah. Is it something about the medium? Is it something about the non-fungibility of text that doesn't lend itself to adaptation? Whereas there's so many different elements in film, for example, where you can interpret a story a different way, visually or sonically, or the way that you structure a film. Maybe it's just because of text that adaptation isn't that popular.
Maybe it's too much effort, because, gotta say, writing a 300,000 word version of Dracula seems like so much effort someone went to.
It is a lot of effort.
That was Iris Achishta of the Powers of Darkness podcast, who appeared in the 3rd episode of this mini-series. These books that play with the characters and plot elements of Dracula, then mould them into quite a different story. Are they just doing what a large sector of fiction is doing in the modern day? Are they, in essence, fan fiction? And what makes some works derived from other works categorised as fan fiction, but others not? The term fan fiction doesn't seem to be applied to the likes of Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys, based on a marginalised character from Jane Eyre, or Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead by Tom Stoppard, that spins a whole play from 2 minor characters in Hamlet. In fact, what about all the plays Shakespeare himself wrote that were based on pre-existing stories? Are those all fanfic plus time? Help me make it make sense. It's not plagiarism if the original works are clearly given attribution. So, how do we define fan fiction?
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Minkle. I'm the editor of Fansplaining and the co-curator of the Rec Center newsletter, which is a FanWorks newsletter. And I've been covering fandom in the mainstream media for, almost 15 years. So I would say that about as long as anyone else has been doing it. And I'm a fan fiction writer. I'm in the X-Men fandom mainly from X-Men First Class, which came out in 2011. It's been 15 years, and we're still writing stories about these 2.
I'm embarrassed even to ask you this question, Elizabeth, but here it comes. What is fan fiction?
Oh, wow. Well, it depends on who you ask.
I'm asking you.
That's right. Well, that's great. No one else gets to weigh in here.
Yeah.
The simplest definition, I think, the very biggest, broadest, contextless definition is when someone takes an existing work and uses that to directly and explicitly create another work. So it's not, I was really influenced by this, and you can kind of feel the traces of it in something else. It is, I am going to take X text and I'm going to create Y text out of it. Whether it's a response to it or I'm just literally lifting out the characters and not really bearing any resemblance to the original. There are big tent definitions of this where you might go back centuries, even millennia, where people will invoke. I just saw some terrible person, I can't remember who it was, say that they were making an AI adaptation of Paradise Lost, and then it said like the greatest work of Bible fan fiction ever told or something. And it's like every second of that hurt me.
Bible fan fiction. I mean, I would say that the Gospels might count, or at least as remixes of each other.
For sure, right? So yeah, if you take that really big tent definition, there's a million things you can put in there. This kind of idea of explicit transformation, explicit retelling. The smaller tent definition is the one that I actually prefer. And when I first started writing about fan fiction, I kind of ran for that big definition because I felt like it made my like longtime hobby seem more serious, right? Like I'm up there, you know, with Milton and Jean Rhys, you know, all the greats. But the smaller tent definition it's much more intentional as a practice. So the smaller definition of fan fiction kind of has its roots in media fandom. Media fandom is a term that was made in opposition to classic science fiction fandom. It was a lot of women being interested in television shows, in particular Star Trek.
Star Trek is often credited for stoking the modern fan fiction movement. The first known fanfic based on the show appeared the year after its debut in the 1967 fanzine Spockanalia, which was, quote, required reading for everyone in our offices, said Star Trek's creator Gene Roddenberry in 1968. The reason for this is that if we all understand what the fans see in the show and try to understand why they are fans at all, we can then continue to hold those fans. Over the years, Gene Roddenberry also spoke encouragingly about fans creating their own works spun off from the show, as long as they made it very clear that they weren't official publications. Ultimately, it's all publicity for the original material. That's the viewpoint a lot of creators and donors of intellectual property that features in fan works have arrived at. The vast majority of the writers of Star Trek fan fiction were female, 90% by 1973.
Those folks in that era started writing their own stories. Star Trek, Starsky and Hutch, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. was a big early one. It was a lot of female fans responding to the text in a way that was kind of specific to their communities, in opposition to kind of the very masculine-coded official science fiction fandom spaces. And so they were writing stories, putting them in zines, mimeographing them, and they would sell them under the table or they would mail them out. This is all being done very much under the radar of the rights holders because it was a lot more precarious and because a lot of it was gay, and this was like the 70s, so obviously attitudes were quite different. And when people came online, fan fiction really started to flourish because a lot of people who didn't know this was a thing suddenly learned about it, right? And so over the last 25 years, you have fans kind of building tools to host this stuff, building websites, using existing websites and also creating new ones to write their own stories about existing properties, creating whole languages of different tropes and structures and ways of tagging the metadata. You have millions of people now reading and writing these stories, and basically almost anything you can think of, someone's probably written a fic about it. Because it's anonymous, it's global, you have people from all over the world writing stories in all sorts of languages. It is just a beautifully amateurish space, right? And so when I go for the smaller tent definition, it's that organicness, that amateur element, that kind of ground up element, the big collective thing that I am really emphasizing. And I think that's quite different than Tom Stoppard or Jean Rhys or any of these other people that you might talk about when you're talking about quote unquote literary transformative works.
They didn't put the time in to the community.
It's not communal. And it's also like, I think people have different motivations. You know, I remember years ago, I heard, it must have been an archival interview with Ray Bradbury because there was a mid-century adaptation of Moby Dick, and he wrote the screenplay. And he was talking about his process. And he said that he just read the book like a million times until it was like internalized within him. And then it like kind of flowed back out. And I was like, that's like literally what I do with fan fiction. I'll watch the movie like 15 times and I'll just read all the fan fiction and I'll get these characters within me. And then I have the tools I need to write a story. And it was interesting to me to think about how we might have very similar creative processes here. And I don't know how he felt about Ahab or Starbuck or whatever, right? Like, I don't know if he loved them as characters.
It's a different motivation, isn't it, being commissioned?
Yeah. He's a famous writer writing a screenplay of a famous book for money. So the context matters. Those differences matter. But it was interesting to me that the act and even the process were similar. When I write fan fiction, I'm thinking of fan fiction readers. I'm not just thinking, oh, I'm writing a story about these two. I'm thinking about the context in which we're all creating this stuff. When I came into covering this, I was like in my 20s. I was feeling defensive. I was like, it's just like Paradise Lost. It's serious. Also, it's like 50 Shades of Grey time is when I started doing this. And everyone was like, oh, steamy world of fan fiction. And I was just like, some of the stories are serious and they don't have sex at all. And then I got over myself and also discovered fan studies. There's an entire academic discipline. Academics who study various parts of pop culture or sexuality studies or whatever to say like, oh, there's a seriousness in the act itself.
I refer you to Transformative Works and Cultures, the journal published by the Organization for Transformative Works.
Even the most inane, frothy pop culture thing, you can study in a serious way. But also, too, I started to realize, I don't want to get too precious about it. I don't want to be like, oh, these are marginalized people wresting power back from the corporate, like the copyright owners or whatever. Because fan fiction has a lot of its own internal biases and problems within the communities, too. So it's not like some great utopia where like every marginalized person gets their day in the sun. But I do think there's a power to that. And it seems like maybe a frivolous kind of subject to connect over. But I think we're doing something meaningful. I think we're creating really interesting literary texts. And I think that studying them on their own terms and understanding them as these network texts within these communities, we're all united around these specific sets of practices. And I think the history of media fandom, a lot of people in those communities are transmasc or non-binary, doing something with these male characters to explore gender. You can see the stats, very few cis men involved in these communities. A lot of women and a lot of non-binary people and a lot of queer people, I would say, predominantly.
Why do you think that is?
The old line is sort of, if you think about the X-Men or Star Wars or whatever, these big giant corporations, right? And they, obviously there's people of all genders who are making it, but they are predominantly men, wealthier men, older men. And so the priorities of storytelling, whether that's in a corporate capacity or just in a taste capacity. You could see how much Gen X men have shaped our current pop culture. It's a little too much, I would say. Then fan fiction comes in opposition to that. You're sort of taking it back from these people who are in power in the culture, and you're creating your own thing.
Making stories that supply what you're not seeing from the more mainstreamed sources. And those empires might then strike back.
You certainly have throughout fandom history many, many instances of rights holders trying to take fan fiction down. Like famously, George Lucas in the 80s went after gay fan fiction. He went after the male-male romance stuff, trying to suppress that. One of the most famously litigious people actually was Anne Rice, and that was also around. It was like late 90s, early 2000s. She went after a bunch of writers too, and actually that left a really big scar in the community. But at a certain point, in the 2000s, I would say most of the rights holders kind of realized that fan fiction was helpful and kind of hands-off. I think that they know it'll be bad press at this point. Like, J.K. Rowling did go after a fan, but it was a guy who had written an encyclopedia.
Let me tell you, Elizabeth, I worked on the book that he was writing while he was being sued by J.K. Rowling.
Oh my God.
Yep.
That's incredible. Obviously, she's done so many worse things since.
Way back before J.K. Rowling was famous for being a campaigner funder for cisgender supremacy, she was actually an author of a series of books about a boy wizard named Harry Potter. It was very successful. Spawned official spin-offs, films, theme parks, stage productions, and many unofficial ones. In my mid-20s, I was an unpaid podcaster by night, and by day a barely paid freelance proofreader and editor. And that's how I worked for a little while with Steve van der Ark, who in 2001 started the Harry Potter Lexicon, a website which documented pretty much every single thing in the Harry Potter books written by J.K. Rowling. Even characters or plants only fleetingly referenced one time. J.K. Rowling herself had publicly expressed appreciation for the lexicon, using it to remind herself of things she'd written and check that details were consistent from one book to another. After the website had been running for a few years, Steve compiled a book of the lexicon. Before the lawsuit was launched, I also proofread that. I vaguely remember trying to tidy up a lot of inconsistently declined Latin in the etymology of the spells. And then, in late 2007, a couple of months after the final book in the original 7-book Harry Potter series came out, Warner Brothers and J.K. Rowling sued the Lexicon Books publisher RDR Books to prevent it being published, lest she might want to publish her own encyclopedia. The judge declared the lawsuit in favour of J.K. Rowling and Warner Brothers, and they were awarded $6,750. I don't even know how many multiples of this sum were earned by the lawyers on each side. But Steve Vander Ark's book version of the Lexicon was allowed to be published, with minor modifications, because some quotations had been lengthy enough to infringe copyright. The lawsuit could have been an email. "Hi Steve, make the quotations shorter, or else. Kind regards." Yeah, this whole thing could have been a 10-word email.
It still annoys me so much. The fact that they were arguing that this was like, it's not transformative because it's going to cut into the future. We're going to make an encyclopedia, right? Like that was one of the arguments. Yeah. They were going to do it. And so they couldn't have this one out there. And they never did it. And it's like, all you did was make this man cry in court, and destroy his life.
I do feel ambivalent about this case. At the time, I thought the sensible outcome, with the proviso that I'm not a lawyer or an author or the superintendent of the Harry Potter Lexicon website or someone who wants that author to be making even more money to spend on causes that directly endanger the lives of trans people, would have been if they had collaborated to publish an official lexicon. He could have done most of the work and she could have taken most of the credit. Anyway, while the Lexicon lawsuit was rumbling on for many months, Steve wrote the other book of his that I proofread. It's called In Search of Harry Potter, and it's a travel log. He went around Britain visiting places that may have inspired Harry Potter locations or had their names borrowed for naming things in the books. And no, doing that didn't get J.K. Rowling sued by a map. Throughout the existence of Harry Potter, there have been many lawsuits or threatened lawsuits concerning its intellectual property, including some against writers of fan fiction. Which is interesting because recently there have been some really lucrative books that originated as Harry Potter fan fiction. For example, Sen-Lin Yu's novel Alchemized, which was published in book form in September 2025, promptly hit #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, and the movie rights had already sold for a 7-figure sum. Alchemized had begun life in 2018 when Sen-Lin Yu began posting it in installments online under the title Manacled, which took the dystopia of The Handmaid's Tale and populated it with the Harry Potter character pairing known as Dramione. Dramione?
It's Draco Malfoy and Hermione Granger. Dramione, a popular ship.
Moreover, Dramione is a portmanteau.
What was dicey was the publishers were marketing it as like Book Talk's beloved Dramione hits. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, okay, well, if you're going to sever the relationship between the two and change your names and all this, then I don't think you can be marketing it on the back of Harry Potter. And so there was a lot of controversy.
Nonetheless, using the Harry Potter Association didn't seem to bring legal problems with regard to marketing Manacled, aka Alchemized. 9 months before the story was published in book form as Alchemized, the online version Manacled was taken down from the biggest fan fiction site, Archive of Our Own, AO3 for short, and the author set about the task of adjusting the aspects that might infringe copyright. This is a practice known as pull to publish.
Also known as filing the serial numbers off. Pulling to publish meaning I want to turn my fan fiction into a professionally published text. I take it off the internet, I pull it, I change it, I publish it.
What kinds of changes would that encompass usually?
It has to be a lot because if you want to sell it, first of all, the interesting thing about fan fiction's legality is it's not so much copyright but trademark. It's not like people are wholesale quoting the source material very often. That's just not a part of fan fiction. You can't copyright an idea, obviously, so even the concepts from these worlds would not be grounds for copyright infringement. But the fact that you're writing X-Men, Magneto, the fact that you're using his name, that would be the problem, right? So like if I were to pull one of my stories and change his name to something similar, I think it would have to be sufficiently transformative to get away with it not being an infringing work.
So the changed name would have to be more of a transformation than, say, Schmagnito. And maybe to be safe, you'd alter what he does and where he is.
But people have been doing this for decades. And the most famous example is 50 Shades of Grey.
50 Shades of Grey began online as sexy stories about the Twilight OTP Bella and Edward under the title Master of the Universe. I don't know if Mattel and Universal would have taken umbrage about that, since they own that name for the He-Man franchise of works and products. Anyway, Well before E.L. James published the first 50 Shades novel in 2011, its name was changed, the characters' names were changed, and their vampirism was also changed.
I think the thing that people outside fan fiction don't really understand sometimes about this stuff is a lot of the transformation happens far before the pull to publish process. She had already changed a lot of it. So in that particular example, the original story, which was like a big hit within the Twilight fandom, was already a human AU. So it's alternate universe is AU. So no more vampires. They're both humans. And it was a billionaire AU. So no more vampires, add billionaire.
It's a far bigger threat in the 21st century.
Billionaire romance obviously comes from romance as well. There's so much crossover between the history of pro-romance and the history of fan fiction. And if you look at some of these famous pull-to-publish works, they might have felt like original characters wearing the skin and the names of the characters that you know. In the late 2010s, we started to see a big wave of pull-to-publish coming out of Reylo, which is Kylo Ren and Rey from Star Wars, which was a huge fandom when those sequel movies came out. The most famous was The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood, which was a big hit.
By the time it made it to print, all the story's Star Wars references had been removed. The lead characters are now Olive, a PhD student, and Adam, a professor at Stanford University in our current galaxy. The Love Hypothesis has also been adapted into a film, which is due to be released in September of this year. And as it happens, the character Adam is played by Tom Bateman, who is, in real life, married to the actor Daisy Ridley, who portrayed Rey in the Star Wars films. So the character she played is the basis for a character who falls in love with a character portrayed by her husband and named Adam after her co-star Adam Driver, who played Kylo Ren. By the way, there's not only Reylo fan fiction about the fictional characters, there's also Dava-fic, portmanteau of Daisy and Driver, about the real people, Adam Driver and Daisy Ridley. Oh, and the Love Hypothesis also contains a bad egg character named Tom Benton, which sounds a bit like Tom Bateman, so you can bet certain corners of the internet are being totally normal about what all this means. Anyway, that's one of the big recent examples of pull to publish.
50 Shades was like kind of a revolutionary thing, like that definitely exposed fan fiction in the mainstream.
And now it is a really big business in book publishing and in adaptations.
There's a lot of people in hot science fiction and fantasy writers right now, also in romance, who cut their teeth in the 2000s and early 2010s writing fan fiction. And so that's certainly changing sensibilities among like original stuff that gets written, and also changing sensibilities on the acquisition side of people saying, oh, I want this kind of thing, understanding this sort of pan-fandom language. Because there's certain tropes and structures and vibes that people who read fan fiction will recognize.
And even though the publishing industry is trawling fan fiction for acquisitions, it is often the case, no longer always, but still a lot, that when the book or the screen adaptation comes out, authors will hush up that their material originated as fan fiction.
I'm a bit of a traditionalist, and I do kind of want to keep fandom, and I don't want it to be like a proving ground for authors or like an audition or people just sticking their stuff on the AO3 so it can get a lot of hits so then they can get a book deal, which is absolutely happening right now. There are ways that Hollywood or publishers can kind of symbiotically work with fans, but you kind of need to know what you're doing.
The law around copyright and use of intellectual property is very complex because, of course, each country has its own laws, which will pertain wherever the material is available. So given the online existence of fan fiction, that's a lot of countries and laws. And the US, where a huge amount of fan fiction is generated, has some of the most fuzzy and interpretable law pertaining to all this, including fair use. The Organisation for Transformative Works, the non-profit that advocates for fan work, as well as runs AO3 and the very useful wiki fanlaw.org, describes fair use as, quote, a basic limit on copyright law that protects free expression. Fair use is a United States legal phrase. However, copyright laws worldwide have limits that keep copyright from being used as a form of private censorship.
The Organization for Transformative Works, they've been around for almost 20 years at this point, and there were a lot of lawyers among their founders, and they set a very firm, like, anti-monetization policy. So when I write my fan fiction, it's very important that I don't ask for tips or mention money in any way. They just wanted to set this blanket policy to make it kind of more permissible under fair use.
Kind of, but not making any money from your works based on copyrighted works doesn't protect you from being landed with a lawsuit. It's just a defense you can use in that lawsuit under US law. Yes, other jurisdictions are available. But even if you win, or if the lawsuit is dropped, lawsuits are really expensive to be embroiled in. So in effect, it's not about which side is right, it's which side is rich. In US law, there are 4 factors for fair use.
If I ripped off your work and you took me to court, and you'd say I'm infringing, and I'd say no, it's protected under fair use, and the judge would assess under these 4 factors. One is the purpose and the character of the intended use. There's a bunch of broad categories that are largely considered fair use.
Criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching including multiple copies for classroom use, scholarship or research. Comedy can be particularly complicated. Parody is often covered by fair use, whereas satire often isn't.
And so this is also about the character of the work and the transformativeness. The Organization for Transformative Works, transformative's right in the name. Because lawyers were involved in the founding of this, they really wanted to emphasize, these are transformative works. This is substantially different. What I write of X-Men does not bear much. If you love the X-Men movies, I don't know if you're going to love my fan fiction, right? And actually, if you hate the X-Men movies, you might love my fan fiction because they're just fundamentally quite different. I'm interested in different things. I still want the characters to feel like the original ones, but they're in quite different situations. And obviously, they say very different words and they have sex with each other. Professor X and Magneto, in case you're wondering.
Is there some kind of rubric about how different something needs to be from an original so that it's not plagiarism?
One of my favorite analogies for fan fiction is jazz because it's improvisational, it's collaborative, but it's also playing with known riffs and patterns. And there's this language you're working with. I say as a musician who's done jazz.
Someone who hath jazzed.
Yes, I have jazzed quite a bit. Took jazz theory in college. So you're all working with this language, but it's in, the quoting, and it's called quoting in jazz, is important. It's fun. People want to see those little references. Fan fiction is metatextual, it's intertextual, right? So I think that is a bit hard because you're not trying to plagiarize. You're trying to transform, but a part of the transformativeness often is that deliberate metatextuality and calling back and that sort of thing. So I think that's a little bit of a tricky thing to parse and why these are often determined on a case-by-case basis.
The second factor for fair use is the nature of the copyrighted work.
If it is fiction or nonfiction, how it was published, whether it was actually published. Every time you make a work, you create a copyright, essentially. But if it's just sitting in your folder somewhere, that's very different, obviously, than if it was a book out on a shelf or even published on the internet.
The third factor is the amount and substantiality of the copyrighted work that was used, and what proportion it is of the whole copyrighted work, and how important it is to the work that uses it.
Anyone who's written a book knows that you have to pay often to quote people at length, to reproduce their words within that, just like you would have to pay to reproduce an image.
You even have to pay for the little, what they call the little quotations at the front of the book. The author has to pay themselves to run those.
I didn't know that. That's why I feel like this is a bit of a scam.
I mean, I want writers to be paid, but that feels like you're just hurting your own.
Yes, it does feel like that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't have to pay anyone to publish journalism on the internet when I quote people at length. And then this is the one that I often come to the most, the fourth factor, the final one, the effect of the use on the work's market value. If you look at the Hermione example or All the Young Dudes, which is one that just sold at the London Book Fair.
For more than £2.5 million, allegedly. All the Young Dudes will be published in book form under the title Wolf Boy by the pseudonymous author B.N. King. It's a Harry Potter fanfic about a romance between the characters Sirius Black and Remus Lupin.
For Warner Brothers and J.K. Rowling to have any sort of copyright case against these works, they'd have to say that people aren't buying the Harry Potter novels because they are buying Alchemized or Wolf Boy. And actually, the Hermione situation was really interesting and kind of a brand new wrinkle here because a lot of people have started binding fan fiction. They'll print out the text and then they'll create folios and then make beautiful covers. But of course, where there's beautiful handmade things that fans make for each other, there's also people doing it on Etsy and charging money for it. And so people were binding these stories and selling them on Etsy.
This was the predicament that Senlin Yu faced when their Hermione fanfic Manacled was already very popular online, but had not yet been officially published in book form. So then, other people were making money from selling it bound into a book.
Yeah, that author was the second most read story on the archive and millions of hits. People were selling copies of that book on Etsy unauthorized for a lot of money, which really put the authors in a bind because then they were like, well, I can't sell this story. And now you're making money off my fan works. So there's a lot of external forces, I think, that are changing the way that the relationships between these texts and the copyright and, a lot of people coming into fandom not really knowing very much about these norms or practices. So they were just like trying to buy a copy of the book because they heard it was a good romance, a good dark romance about sex slavery.
Oh, God.
Yeah, it's so transformed to me that I can't imagine an argument in which you'd say that that would have any bearing on the value of the Harry Potter franchise. To me, if anything, that book is taking away from the market of like the other dark romances in that space.
Yes, I feel if you're wanting to read Harry Potter originals with your 7-year-old, choosing something where somebody is sold into sex slavery is quite a different pace.
But I think that the people in these communities, especially the adults in these communities, have always been pretty conscious of the fact that, like, this is for adults. People, I think, have always been pretty good about the fact that they want to draw these barriers and say this is clearly, we're writing romantic stories or writing erotic stories. Like, a huge portion of fan fiction and a very important part is erotic stories of sex, right? There's a big category called PWP, porn without plot. And it is meant to be, masturbatory fodder and arousing, and it's very explicit.
I suppose some people would be wondering, listening to you talk about that, why not just write PWP about original characters and thus save yourself several kinds of hassle, including legal, and you might not want to be associated with certain authors after they go off.
Right. There's different reasons that people are drawn to fan fiction. For me, this has just always been an instinct that I have. I was writing it before I had an internet connection. I was writing it in my room. I was like, I love these characters. I'm going to spin up new worlds for them. I'm going to spin up new narratives for them. And so when people are writing, especially huge portion is romance, and I think it's probably pretty easy to see if you've ever had a romance, if you've ever shipped, which is like desiring to see two or more characters get together.
Ship and shipping and shipped derived from relationshipper, which was a term in online fan communities that originated in the mid-1990s to denote people who wanted Mulder and Scully to get together in the X-Files. That was the ship they shipped.
You can see that potential. You see the vibes, you see the lingering glances or whatever, and it's pleasurable for you to fill those gaps. And sometimes you're doing it with the author, and sometimes you're doing it in between the margins. But for me, and I think for a lot of fan fiction people, it is about this kind of communal thing together. It's not just, I love the idea of these two characters together. It's all those people do too. We all love it together. We're connecting across the words. These are network texts. My work is probably much more in response to the other tens of thousands of stories in my fandom than it is even to the original source material at this point.
You've mentioned romance a lot. Are many of the stories in this space not romance?
It's changed a lot over time. So when I got into fandom, absolutely. Romance was a portion. You had a lot more stuff that was what we call gen. So it's like general, no romance. It's just stories. Like they're doing stuff or whatever. And I think it's now down to like 1 in 8 stories do not have a romantic pairing. And so that's a pretty dramatic shift, I think, after a lot of mainstreaming of these communities, a lot of people coming from romance into them. And I would say over time, romance has really, really reshaped a lot of this. I think that you get a lot more things with romantic ships. You get a lot more stuff that looks like pro-romance. It'll be the shape of a romance novel. It'll have the beats of a romance novel. The rules of the romance world, the genre, are like, it must have a happy ending. Like it must conform to a specific sort of structure in the end. You can deviate from the beats, but like you need the beats.
Like a Shakespearean tragedy. Everyone's got to die at the end.
Yeah, exactly. Sure. I mean, like romance and mystery are the two modern genres, I think, that have the strongest community norms about what needs to happen by the end.
There's a really interesting episode in the Allusionist back catalogue called A Novel Remedy, which talks about how between the world wars, people turned to cosy detective fiction, where death was bloodless and there was a proper ending and no loose ends, because those kinds of stories were comforting after earth-shattering events. And I wonder if there's some of that at play in our current era in both the burgeoning popularity of romance and the intensified expectations of what has to be in it, because it has been a time to be alive. and thus people might gravitate more to material that isn't going to add stress by springing unpleasant surprises. It feels reassuring to know where it is going to go.
Back in the day, you'd read tons of stories where there would be romantic stuff or sex, and they would not wind up together at the end. And now, every story I write, they have to be together at the end because I just feel like people will scream at me.
Okay. It doesn't seem particularly ideal conditions for creating your own work if you're worried about people getting really angry because of people not getting together at the end, for instance.
In mainstream publishing, particularly in romance and YA, where you can clearly see in the last 15 years, there's a lot of clunky stuff because people are very worried about an audience reaction. For me personally, there's certainly stuff that I've written in my fan fiction where I've had these thoughts because obviously I've witnessed 8,000 blow-ups across all these different genres and practices in the social media era. Mm-hmm. But I've also tried to remind myself that I do want to tell the story I want to tell. The one I wrote most recently, they were just married. It wasn't about them getting together. It was a thriller with a murder plot and they just happened to be married. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't about them meeting or doing any rom-com things together. So
Wide Sargasso Sea has been very critically respected. A lot of the continuations of Pride and Prejudice, by Emma Tennant, are respected. Shakespeare, adapting Danish or Italian stories, people are cool. Why has it been that this stuff from our lifetimes has not been met with similar kind of seriousness, compassion, I guess? Is it the corporations being involved? Because Jane Eyre obviously was not a corporation, so Jean Rhys had a bit more freedom.
Yeah, I think gender is a big factor. I mean, I guess you just named a couple of women, but I think inherently there's a stigma around it that's carried on. I think it is because it's mostly women doing it.
And mostly women reading it.
I think it is because it's disproportionately gay compared to regular popular culture. And I think also this kind of idea that people might be expressing their most self-indulgent desires because it's fan fiction, so you could do whatever you want. It's you have the audacity to imagine a story that's not on the page.
You took your unruly desires and didn't bury them.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you think it's sort of time as well? Because if you're doing Jane Eyre or Pride and Prejudice, that's stuff from 200 years ago. So automatically it has some added respectability of just age. And a lot of things that at the time they appeared were very kind of controversial, like Dracula. If you read it now, you're come on, what on earth was getting censored about this? This is dry as.
Yeah.
But these things that are from, living memory, maybe not enough time has passed yet to neutralize a lot of the currents therein, perhaps.
Maybe, but when I think about real person fiction, RPF, which is the subset of fan fiction and shipping that's about real people, there's a strong argument to be made there to say why, biopics win Oscars?
Inspired by the life of Bob Dylan.
Yeah. Whereas if I wrote Bob Dylan fan fiction where he's having sex with, I don't know, Pete Seeger or whatever, then that would be cringy and embarrassing.
I mean,
and I should feel bad.
It was already pretty cringy that he was doing the Judas thing on the wrong continent. And I don't even care.
I'm not going to write this one. Don't worry.
It's okay, Elizabeth. You don't have to. I searched AO3 for Pete Seeger / Bob Dylan stories. And there are a handful. But from what I could see, most of them were not sexual. Most were in the category called sick fic. Pete and his wife Toshi take care of Bob when he pukes, or in another version, when he has diarrhea. A complete unknown chickened out of depicting that. Of course, there is loads of fan fiction about real famous people, musicians, actors, sports players, historical characters. In fact, the Brontes are not only characters in real person fiction, they wrote it themselves, concocting elaborate fantasy sagas about the Duke of Wellington and Napoleon. Now, the real people who are still alive could sue RPF authors for things like libel, although doing so would likely be unsuccessful as long as the material was clearly fiction and the author's intent wasn't malicious or defamatory. On AO3, I learned there is some fic with my brother in it, and I need to know what laws exist to protect me from that, because I don't think me being harrowed is covered by copyright.
when I think about 19th century copyright and then I look at where we wound up like 150 years later or whatever, I sometimes despair a little bit because I just feel like a lot of the intentions were very good and they're about protecting an author's right to sell their own work. Dickens famously got ripped off left and right. And, you know, those were the kind of protections that were put in place for to say that like, it was about literally making copies. So you couldn't go write your little Nell stories or whatever and just sell them for, 1 penny instead of 2. And now the 20th century story of copyright is these giant corporations kind of having a stranglehold over beloved stories. And it's about extending the life of copyright for decades and decades and decades to the point where I think people express even reluctance to have creative thoughts about things that are copyrighted. They'll say, oh, that's Disney-owned Star Wars, so I can think my own thoughts about it that are not canonical or whatever.
Look, I wouldn't put it past any big company to monetize our thought crimes.
Every year, works of art age out of copyright and they come into the public domain. And for the last few years, I listened to a lot of National Public Radio. They've been very good at talking about public domain and explaining what it is and saying, well, now all these works are in the public domain. And I love that. But every time, invariably, the expert they get on to talk about it will say something like, now you're free to write your own stories about this character. Mm-hmm. And it's like, you were free to do that before. You were not doing a thought crime before when you imagined like Jay Gatsby doing, I don't know, whatever you wanted him to do, like flying to the moon. And now I'm allowed to think any thought about him because he's not owned by... We've allowed corporations in particular to have such a venerated position in our culture. I remember being at Comic-Con once and like listening to people argue about like who's better owner of Spider-Man.
No.
It's a little absurd because the actual question here is like who's making better works with this character? Who's putting together better teams to make better films? Who has a more accurate feeling representation of this like character that's had many iterations but like still has this thread of Spider-Man-iness running through his history, right?
I mean, you might put it, whose financial interests are best aligned with the art.
Right. But so when they argue about it, they literally sounds like who should get custody of Spider-Man, which dad should, like dad Sony or dad Marvel or Disney or whatever. And it's like
his aunt's probably got custody.
But like, you know, it's absurd, the kind of idea of like the ownership of our stories and the ownership of our imaginations. And when you think about what inspires you, or like when I think about my own fan fiction, I don't know if you write fiction.
No, I haven't got the knack.
You never know. You should try some fan fiction. It's low stakes.
I don't feel that about anything. I don't feel that kind of...
You don't have this instinct?
I don't have the sort of possession. I'm sort of quite a passive consumer of other people's art where I'm like, this is what they've chosen to give me.
See, but maybe you've just let the corporation colonize your mind, man.
Yeah, all those like Norwegian indie films and shit I watch.
Colonizing your mind.
Yeah. Elizabeth Minkle is the co-curator of the Rec Centre newsletter about fan culture, and she is the editor of Fansplaining, featuring smart writing about fan culture, analysis, essays and criticism. Plus, there is a deep back catalogue of the Fansplaining podcast. All is available at fansplaining.com. And that was Iris Achishta you heard at the start of the episode. Listen to her podcasts Powers of Darkness and Or Whatever Movies. Look, I might not be a practitioner of fan fiction, but I have been working in a self-published medium for nearly 20 years now. This one, independent podcasting. I'm self-taught. Well, I started so long ago there was nobody else to teach me. And the show is owned by me. I've never been an employee or had one. And I just make stuff from my living room, except for when I work in bed. The arse has really fallen out of the ad podcast market since I refused to do sponsorship that is to do with gambling, pharmaceuticals, or nice washing banks, which is why I am so grateful to you legends who keep the show afloat financially by becoming paid members of the Illusiverse at theillusionist.org/donate. Something else that is extremely helpful and also entirely free of charge is to recommend this show to other people. Support us independent self-publishers with no corporate daddies and also no pension or sick pay by telling other people about the stuff you like. We love that. Your randomly selected word from the dictionary today is puissance. Noun. 1. A competitive test of a horse's ability to jump large obstacles in show jumping. 2. Archaic or poetic/literary. Great power, influence or prowess. Try using puissance in an email today. This episode was produced by me, Helen Zaltzman, on the unceded, ancestral and traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. Thanks to Martin Orstwick of palebirdmusic.com for editorial help and the music. Also thanks to Allusionist Caroline Crampton of She Done It podcast and the excellent newsletter that you can subscribe to at carolinecrampton.com. Listen to or read every episode and get more information about the topics and people they're in. See photos of the full dictionary entries for the randomly selected words. Follow me on whichever social media platforms are still undead and peruse listings for events coming up. I will be appearing at Sewa, readings of deliciously rotten writing in Vancouver on the 28th of July. But if you're in Canada, Australia or the UK and want to book in an Allusionist live spectacle, get in touch via the contact page. It's all at the show's forever home, theallusionist.org.